I want to be honest about the decision-making that led me to that cabin, because I think it matters. I'd been planning the trip for 6 weeks, a solo traverse of a section of the Blue Ridge I'd never covered, off-trail for most of it, the kind of backcountry that requires you to navigate by topographic map and pay attention to what the terrain is actually doing, rather than following a maintained path. I'd done trips like this before, not frequently, but enough to know my own capabilities and limitations. I was not a beginner. I was not someone who made impulsive decisions in the backcountry. I tell you this because what happened was not the result of inexperience, and I've spent enough time since working through it to know that experience wouldn't have changed much. The storm came up faster than the forecast had suggested, and the cabin was there and I went inside. Anyone would have. The third day had started well. I was moving through second-growth hardwood on a northeast bearing, following a ridgeline that my topo showed dropping into a creek drainage about 2 miles ahead where I planned to make camp. The weather had been unsettled since morning, not threatening, just that gray, non-committal Blue Ridge sky that can hold that quality for days without producing anything. And I was making good time and paying more attention to the terrain than to the clouds above the canopy. The storm announced itself the way late summer Blue Ridge storms do, which is without much warning. The sky went from gray to green-gray in about 20 minutes, and the wind came up from the southwest with a temperature drop that I felt through my base layer immediately. I'd been in enough of these to know I had maybe 30 minutes before it opened up, and I was 4 miles off any marked trail with no natural shelter in the immediate terrain that I could identify from my map. I picked up my pace and started looking. The clearing appeared between 2 large white oaks at the bottom of a slope I'd been descending for about 10 minutes. I stopped at the tree line and looked across it at the cabin before I did anything else. That's a habit: you stop and look before you approach an unknown structure in the backcountry, because the range of things that can be using an abandoned building is wide and not all of them welcome company. I stood and looked for maybe 2 minutes. The cabin showed no signs of current occupation that I could see from 50 feet. The door was standing open about 6 inches, hanging slightly on its hinges, which is what doors do in structures that haven't been maintained. A maintained door gets shut. A neglected door gets left the way it was last, and then moves with the weather over the years, until it finds whatever position the hinges and gravity settle on. The structure itself was old log construction with the corner notching style I associate with pre-1940s mountain building. The timbers chinked with what had once been a mortar mixture that had mostly fallen out over the decades, leaving irregular gaps between the logs that the weather had been coming through for a long time. The metal roof was the kind that gets installed as an upgrade at some point in the life of an old structure and then outlasts everything else about it. Corrugated steel, rusted along every exposed edge, with maybe a third of the sheets having come loose from the purlins or separated at the seams. It would keep most of a rain off. In the kind of storm that was coming, most was good enough. I pushed the door open with my shoulder and went in. The interior was a single room, which I'd expected from the exterior dimensions. A wood stove in the far right corner, cast iron, the kind that was made to last forever and generally does. A collapsed cot frame along the left wall, the canvas rotted away and the wooden crosspieces broken, the metal frame lying at an angle against the logs. A rough shelf on the wall opposite the door, with 3 mason jars still on it, empty, the lids rusted in place. The floor was wide plank wood, soft in places where water had been coming through the roof gaps for years, solid in others. There was no loft, no partition, nothing else. It was exactly what it looked like, a seasonal structure, probably used for hunting, left behind when whoever had used it stopped coming. I dropped my pack against the wall nearest the door and started getting my wet gear arranged. The rain hit the metal roof as I was pulling out my ground pad, which meant my timing had been almost exactly right. It was loud. That particular percussion of rain on corrugated metal amplifies everything, turns a moderate rainfall into something that fills the whole space with sound. I lit my small camp stove for warmth and made coffee and sat with my back against the wall and listened to the storm work itself out. I'd been inside for close to 2 hours when I noticed the wood stove. I'm not sure what made me move toward it. I'd been sitting on the far side of the room and hadn't gone near it. I hadn't needed to. My camp stove was doing its job, and the cast iron stove was just part of the furniture, as far as I was concerned. But I got up to check the state of the roof in one corner where I'd noticed a drip, and passing the stove, I put my hand on it the way you automatically touch things when you walk past them. Just a contact, palm flat on the top surface. It was warm, not hot, not recently burning warm, but the kind of warmth that cast iron holds for a long time after a fire has gone out, that deep retained heat that the metal stores in its mass and releases slowly for hours. I stood with my hand on the stovetop and recalibrated everything I'd assumed about the cabin in the last 2 hours. This fire had been burning within the last several hours. Not days. Hours. I stood still and processed that. Then I processed the smell, which I'd been noticing since I came in, and had attributed to old wood and damp and the general must of a closed structure that had been open to the weather for years. I breathed it in deliberately now, underneath everything else. Fresh wood smoke. The specific smell of recent combustion, not the ambient smokiness that gets into old wood over decades of use. Someone had been in this cabin today. They had built a fire, let it burn, and either left before I arrived or were somewhere I hadn't identified yet. I turned around slowly and looked at the cabin, the way you look at a familiar room when you've been told something is wrong with it. The collapsed cot, the shelf with its jars, the door behind me, now pushed to about halfway open by my entry, the floor, the walls, the 2 small windows, both with their original glass still in the frames, intact, too grimy to see through clearly. Nothing moved. There was no sound from inside the cabin except the rain on the roof. Then I looked at the floor near the stove. The dust and grit that had accumulated on the wood planks was disturbed in a pattern that made sense if someone had been sitting or crouching in front of the stove tending a fire. Not dramatic, not footprints, nothing cinematic. Just the difference between undisturbed grime and grime that has been moved by the presence of a person in a space. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I moved to the door and stood in the opening and looked at the clearing. The rain was heavy now and the tree line was reduced to gray shapes in the downpour, and I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. Nothing moved in what I could see. The clearing was empty. I went back inside and stood in the center of the room and thought carefully about my options. Leaving meant going back into a storm that was at its height with nowhere to go. Staying meant being in a structure that someone else had used within the last few hours and might return to. I thought about what kind of person uses an unmarked backcountry cabin 4 miles off any trail in the Blue Ridge. The range of answers to that question was not uniformly comfortable. I moved my pack to the corner farthest from the door and sat with my back in the angle of the 2 walls where I could see the door and both windows. I got my knife out of the side pocket of my pack and put it in my jacket pocket. I turned off my camp stove so there would be no light visible through the grimy windows. I sat in the gray stormlight and I waited and I listened. The rain began to slacken around the 2-hour mark. I heard, at some point in that stretch, a sound from somewhere outside that wasn't rain and wasn't wind. A single sound, brief, from the direction of the tree line to the north of the clearing. Not an animal sound I could identify with confidence. Not a branch falling, something closer to a footstep on wet ground, but with a hesitation after it that didn't belong to any animal's gait I knew. Then nothing. For 20 minutes, nothing. When the rain had dropped to a light, steady fall, I made my decision. I packed my gear in the quiet and efficient way you pack when you want to make no noise and be ready to move. I shouldered my pack. I stood in the doorway for a full minute and watched the clearing and the tree lines on all sides. Nothing moved. I walked north to the tree line, which meant walking toward the direction of that sound, and for a moment before I reached the trees, I felt something that I'm going to describe as accurately as I can. Not fear exactly, not the biological response to immediate threat. Something more like the feeling of being assessed, of being in the field of attention of something that was deciding about me. Then I was in the trees and moving, and the feeling passed, and I put the miles in until dark and made camp far from any clearing. I've told 2 people about this trip. Neither of them asked the question that has bothered me most about it, which is not who was in that cabin or why. It's simpler than that. The door had been standing open 6 inches when I arrived. I don't know which direction it had been opened from. My brother Owen and I have been hiking the Blue Ridge together since I was 14 and he was 11, which means by the time this happened, we had somewhere north of 20 years of that terrain in our legs and our instincts. We knew which creek crossings ran high in spring, and which trails the rangers stopped maintaining in the 90s, and where the old roads went that aren't on any current map. We'd found things out there over the years, the remnants of settlements, a collapsed church with its bell still in the tower, hunters' camps that hadn't been used in decades, a stone spring house, so well built it was still holding water, 100 years after whoever built it had stopped needing it to. We had a comfortable relationship with the abandoned and the forgotten. We didn't spook easily, and we didn't treat everything we found as significant. Most of it was just the ordinary archaeology of a landscape that people had been living and working in for generations, and then, gradually, leaving behind. That comfort level is the thing I've thought about most in the years since Fork Mountain. It wasn't recklessness, exactly. It was the familiarity that accumulates when you've done something enough times without consequence. The way the absence of past harm starts to feel like a guarantee of future safety. We'd found a dozen abandoned cabins, and nothing bad had happened. And so, when we found the cabin in the draw below Fork Mountain, we walked toward it with the easy curiosity of people who already knew how this kind of thing went. We'd come off the main ridge trail in the early afternoon and dropped into the draw to find water. It was late May, warm enough that the creek drainage would be a relief from the exposed ridge, and Owen had a candidate for a campsite marked on his topo that was supposed to be a flat area near a reliable spring. The draw was steep-sided and heavily wooded, the kind of terrain that hides things you can be 50 feet from a structure and not see it until the trees clear slightly. We heard the creek before we saw the cabin, and we saw the cabin only because I happened to look through a gap in the hemlocks at the right angle and caught the corner of the stone foundation. I said something to Owen and we changed direction and pushed through the hemlock screen, and there it was in a small, irregular clearing that the hemlocks had been encroaching on for years. I'm going to describe it carefully because I think the ordinariness of it matters to understanding what came next. It was a well-built structure, hewn log construction, the logs squared with an adze rather than just peeled, which indicated someone who either knew what they were doing or had been taught by someone who did. Proper stone foundation, dry stacked but done with care, the corners tight. A stone chimney on the north end that had lost maybe the top 3 feet, but was otherwise intact and vertical, which is notable because chimneys are usually the first thing to go in an unmaintained structure. The roof had been metal. At some point you could see the rusted remnants of corrugated sheeting and the nail holes in the purlins, but most of it had come down in sections over the years. The interior open to the weather for probably a decade or more, based on the state of the floor. Owen got to the door first. The door was wood, plank construction, hanging slightly but still in its frame and still mostly functional. He put his shoulder to it and it opened inward and we both went in. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Every surface was carved. I want to be precise about this because I think the word decorated might come to mind, and I want to head that off. This was not decoration. Decoration implies an aesthetic intention, a desire to make something more pleasing or meaningful in an expressive sense. What covered the walls of that cabin was not that. It was marking, systematic, exhaustive, driven by something other than aesthetics. The walls from floor to approximately shoulder height were covered completely in carved symbols, the same symbol, repeated, filling every available inch of the hewn log faces with the careful regularity of someone working a pattern. The ceiling beams had it. The door we'd just come through had it on both faces. Carved so densely the wood had a different texture than uncarved wood, rougher, the surface broken into the slight ridges and valleys of overlapping cuts. The floor planks had it, fainter here because foot traffic and moisture had worn the cuts down over time, but visible when the light caught at an angle. Even the shelf brackets on the interior wall had been carved on their upper faces, though they were too narrow for more than 2 or 3 repetitions of the symbol. The symbol itself I've tried to describe to people and never been satisfied with the description. It was a simple form, not complex, not the kind of thing that would take long to execute individually, which made the sheer volume of repetitions more troubling rather than less. Perhaps 1.5 inches tall, carved to maybe 1/8 of an inch depth with something sharp and controlled. I'm not going to reproduce it here because I've thought about whether I want to do that and decided against it, for reasons I'll get to. I'll say that it wasn't any symbol I recognized from any tradition I was aware of, and I've spent enough time since looking that I'm reasonably confident it doesn't correspond to anything in the standard reference materials for regional folk practice, early American religious symbolism, or anything else I've been able to access. Owen was quieter than I was, which was unusual. He's generally the one who speaks first, who names things, who processes out loud. He stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly and looked at all of it and said nothing for a long time. I moved along the wall and looked at the carvings up close. What struck me first was the consistency. Not just that the same symbol was repeated, that the repetitions were nearly identical. Same depth, same proportions, same orientation. You'd expect some variation when a person works over a long period, some drift in the forms as hands tire or habits shift. There was almost none. I looked at carvings near the door and carvings at the far end of the room, and the variance between them was minimal, less than you'd expect, even from a careful craftsperson working deliberately. It was the consistency of someone for whom this had become so ingrained that variation was no longer possible. Not a practiced skill, a compulsion. The time this would have taken was something I couldn't stop calculating. The surface area of those walls, covered at that density, would have required thousands of individual carvings. If someone had worked at it for several hours a day, every day, I estimated months at minimum, more likely over a year. Someone had lived in this cabin and spent the dominant portion of their time here doing this, covering every surface they could reach with the same symbol over and over until there was no more room. It was Owen who pointed out the circle. He said my name quietly, the way he says it when he wants my attention, without wanting to raise his voice, and I crossed the room to where he was standing near the center. There was an area on the floor, roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, where the carvings were absent, not worn away absent. The surrounding floor planks were carved, the symbol packed as densely there as everywhere else, but within this circle the wood was bare. More than bare. It was worn smooth in a way that the rest of the floor wasn't. The grain of the wood polished to a slight sheen, the kind of finish that comes from prolonged contact, from something standing in that spot, or moving within it, for a very long time. We stood and looked at it. The light was coming in through the gaps in the ruined roof and shafts that moved slightly as the canopy above shifted in the wind. And the carved walls in that shifting light had a quality I'm not going to try to describe poetically because I don't think poetry serves it. It was just wrong. The wrongness was specific and physical, the way a smell or a sound can be wrong, not an interpretation, but a direct sensory response to something the body understands before the mind catches up. I took photographs. I took a lot of them, working methodically around the room, because I knew I would need to look at this again somewhere that wasn't here, somewhere with distance and light and the ordinary world present. Owen was still standing near the circle, and I noticed he hadn't moved for several minutes, which was unlike him. I said his name. He looked at me, and then looked at the floor, and then looked back at me and said we should go. He said it the way you say something when the decision is already made, and the words are just the formality of communicating it. We left without discussing it further. I've looked at those photographs many times since. The resolution is good enough to study the symbol in detail, and I've done that. I've shown the images to 2 people I trust, one of whom has an academic background in Appalachian cultural history, and one of whom has spent decades documenting folk religious practice in the rural South. Neither of them recognized the symbol. The historian suggested it might be a personal system, something invented rather than inherited, meaningful only to whoever made it. The other person looked at the photographs for a long time and then handed my phone back and said something I've thought about regularly since. She said that the question that mattered wasn't what the symbol meant. It was what the person who made it was trying to keep out or keep in. I've never gone back to Fork Mountain. Owen and I have hiked the Blue Ridge many times since, though never that specific section of the draw below the summit. We've never talked about what we saw in any depth, a few references. The shorthand that develops between people who've shared something they don't fully understand. He knows I've been trying to identify the symbol. He's never asked if I've succeeded. Last spring, he called me to talk about a trip he was planning, a section we'd been meaning to do for years, and at the end of the call he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd been having a recurring dream. He didn't describe it in detail. He said he kept dreaming about a circle on a wooden floor, and that in the dream the circle was empty, and that something about its emptiness was the worst part. I didn't tell him that I'd been having the same dream. I'm telling you now because I think the time for keeping it to myself has probably passed, and because I want there to be a record of it somewhere outside my own head. Whatever was in that cabin in the draw below Fork Mountain, whatever made that circle smooth in the middle of all that marking, I think it's still there. I think it's been there a long time. And I think the reason the circle was empty is not because nothing had been in it, but because whatever was in it had been there long enough that the distinction between the thing and the space it occupied had stopped mattering. The symbol is still in my phone. I still look at it sometimes. I'm still trying to understand what it means to have been in a room full of it, and to have stood at the edge of that circle and to have left. I'm still trying to understand what it means that leaving felt like permission. I've been doing solo trips into the Blue Ridge for going on 15 years. And in that time, I've developed the kind of relationship with backcountry solitude that's hard to explain to people who don't seek it out. It's not that I'm indifferent to risk, I'm not. I take preparation seriously, and I don't make careless decisions in the field, but I've spent enough nights alone in remote terrain that the baseline anxiety most people feel in those situations has largely been replaced by something closer to attentiveness. I notice things. I read what I'm in. I don't startle easily, and I don't populate the dark with things that aren't there. My wife will tell you I'm the least imaginative person she knows, and she means it as a mild criticism, but out there it's served me well. I say all of this because I want to be clear about what kind of person was lying in a sleeping bag beside Hawksbill Creek at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in late September, listening to the sound of a padlock knocking against a hasp from inside a locked building. And I want to be clear that what I felt was not the product of an overactive imagination or the particular suggestibility that comes from being alone in the dark. What I felt was the specific, grounded fear of someone who has correctly identified that something is wrong. The trip had been straightforward up to that point. 3 days planned, the first 2 of which had been exactly what I'd come for: good terrain, good weather, the particular quality of late September in the Blue Ridge, where the light has gone gold and the air has enough of a bite to make the walking feel good. I was following a general route rather than a specific trail, moving through the watershed above Hawksbill Creek, dropping to the creek for water and then climbing back to the ridge for movement and views. Standard for how I travel out there. I found the cabin on the afternoon of the second day, about an hour before I planned to make camp. I'd taken a game trail off the ridge to get down to the creek level, a faint path through the understory, probably deer-made, the kind of route that's passable if you're paying attention and invisible if you're not. The trail broke out of the timber onto a small flat area, maybe half an acre of relatively level ground between the creek and the slope, the kind of place that makes sense to build on and probably always has. The cabin was at the back of the flat, set against the slope, partially screened by a stand of rhododendron that had grown up around its foundation over what looked like several decades. I stopped at the edge of the flat and looked at it the way I always look at unknown structures before I approach giving it time, reading what it was telling me. Single room, from the exterior dimensions, log walls, old, the chinking gone in most places. The windows had been boarded from the outside with rough-cut lumber, the boards still solid, which told me someone had done this intentionally, and relatively recently, within the last decade or two, not a century ago. And the door had a padlock on it, a modern padlock, a heavy-duty master lock on a steel hasp that had been lag-bolted into the door frame, the metal still holding its finish, no serious rust. The padlock was not old. I noted all of this and made my assessment. Someone owned this structure, or felt they had a claim to it and had secured it against casual entry. That was the most ordinary explanation, and I had no reason to look past it. Hunters sometimes lock up seasonal camps. People with property in the backcountry sometimes maintain structures that don't appear on any public map. The padlock was not an invitation and not a mystery. It was a padlock. I moved past the flat and continued along the creek for about 300 yards until I found a good campsite, a level area on the bank with a fire ring that someone had built at some point. The rocks blackened from past use, the ground around it worn in the way that a good campsite accumulates, where over years of occasional visitors. I set up my tent, filtered water, made dinner, and sat by a small fire until the cold coming off the creek made sitting still uncomfortable. By 9:30, I was in my bag with my headlamp off and I was asleep inside of 10 minutes. I woke at 2. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately after the sound, the way you check a watch when you want to anchor an experience to a specific moment before your mind starts working on it. 2:03. I was lying on my side facing the direction of the cabin, which I couldn't see from my tent but which I knew was roughly northwest of me, and the sound had come from that direction. I lay still and ran it back. A metallic sound, brief. The specific resonance of metal on metal, not a ring, not a scrape, but a knock. The sound of a heavy object contacting another heavy object once and stopping. I knew what it was before I'd finished processing the sound consciously, the way you know a voice before you've identified the words. It was the sound of the padlock swinging on its hasp and contacting the door. I lay still and breathed and listened. It came again, the same sound, the same duration, the same single contact and silence. A pause, 30 seconds, maybe 40, then a third time, then nothing. I stayed in my bag and I thought carefully about what could make that sound in that context. Wind moving the padlock was my first candidate, and I held it up and examined it. There was no wind. The trees above my tent were still. The air around the creek cold and settled the way late September backcountry air gets at that hour. Not a breath of movement. Wind dismissed. An animal contacting the door was my second candidate. Something large enough to move a heavy padlock. A bear, a deer, making contact with the door. Possible. But the sound had been consistent across 3 occurrences, in a way that animal contact rarely is. Same sound, same single knock, same pause pattern. Animals produce varied contact. This was regular. I was still working through the third candidate, the one I didn't want to reach, when the sound came from inside the cabin. I want to describe this as accurately as I can because accuracy is the only thing I have to offer. What I heard was the sound of a cot. If you have ever been in a room with a military-style canvas cot and watched someone lie down on it, you know the sound, the specific elastic creak of the canvas taking weight, the slight metallic complaint of the frame, the settling sequence as the weight distributes and the cot adjusts. It's a distinctive sound, not easily confused with anything else. And what came from inside that padlocked cabin was exactly that. One settling sequence, like someone lying down on a cot. Then silence. I lay in my sleeping bag and did not move for a long time. The logical sequence of what I'd heard was this. Something had knocked the padlock against the hasp 3 times from inside. Then something had gotten onto a cot inside the cabin. The door was padlocked from the outside. I was the only person for several miles in any direction who had any right to be there, and I was in my tent 300 yards downstream, and whatever was on that cot was not me. I've run through the alternatives many times since. The acoustics of the creek drainage could have distorted sound, could have made something from a different direction seem to originate from the cabin. I've thought about this seriously and I can't make it work. The cabin was upslope and upstream of me. A clear line, no major terrain features between us to deflect sound. I know what I heard, and I know where it came from. The other alternative is that the sequence of sounds was coincidental, that the padlock knock and the cot sound were unrelated events, produced by unrelated causes, that happened to occur in a pattern that my brain assembled into a narrative. I've thought about this too. 3 occurrences of the padlock sound, evenly spaced, followed by a cot sound from the same structure. My brain may be a narrative-making machine, but it's not making that narrative without the raw material. I broke camp quietly. Not in a panic. Panic is loud and slow, and I didn't want to be either. I packed the way I've practiced packing in low-light conditions. Everything going into its place by feel and order. My headlamp on its lowest red light setting, so I had just enough to work by. I had the tent down and the pack on my back in under 12 minutes. I checked my compass and set a bearing for the trailhead, which was roughly 2 miles south and downslope, and I started moving. I did not pass the cabin flat. I stayed on the creek's east bank, which put the flat on the opposite side of the water, and I moved at a pace that was faster than comfortable hiking but short of running. Running in backcountry dark is how you turn an ankle. I moved fast, and I moved carefully, and I did not use more light than I had to. I heard nothing behind me. I stopped twice in the first mile and stood still and listened for any sound that was following my movement through the drainage. Both times, water, the wind that had picked up slightly, my own breathing, nothing else. I hit the trailhead at 4:15 in the morning, got in my truck, and drove to an all-night diner 40 minutes east where I sat with coffee until the sun came up and the world felt like itself again. I've been back to that section of the Blue Ridge twice since. Different routes, different ridgelines, nothing that takes me down to the Hawksbill Creek drainage. I've thought about reporting what I found to the Forest Service. The cabin, the padlock, the fact that someone or something appeared to be using a locked structure in the backcountry. But I've thought about what reporting would require me to say and what I'd be willing to put my name on, and I haven't made the call. What I know is that a door was padlocked from the outside and something was inside it. What I know is that the padlock knocked 3 times, and then a cot took weight, and then the night was quiet again. What I know is that I have done solo backcountry trips for 15 years, and that was the only time I have ever broken camp in the dark and moved for a trailhead without stopping. I trust that instinct. I don't know what made those sounds. I don't know what was in that cabin or why it was there or what the padlock on the outside of the door was meant to accomplish. I've decided I probably don't want to know. There are things in the Blue Ridge that have been there longer than the trails, longer than the structures people built and left, and most of them have no particular interest in the people passing through. This one, whatever it was, seemed content in the dark of that cabin, on that cot, behind that locked door. I was content to leave it there. I still am. The trail register at the Spittler Knoll parking area is one of those weathered wooden boxes on a post that the Forest Service maintains with varying degrees of consistency. Sometimes there's a pen that works, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the register book has been sitting in there long enough that the pages have gone soft with humidity, and your entry joins a record that goes back several years in deteriorating ink. I signed in on a Saturday morning in mid-November and paged back through the recent entries before I closed the box. The last entry before mine was 11 days prior. One person, solo, 2-night trip, the same general area I was heading into. Before that, a group of 4 from early October. The shoulder season had done what it always does to these mountains, which is return them to something closer to what they actually are when the weekend traffic clears out. I was glad for it. I've hiked that section of the Blue Ridge in every season, and November is the one I keep coming back to, the one that feels most like the place itself rather than a recreation of it. The leaves are down by then, and the views open up through the hardwoods, and the cold keeps you honest about your pace and your planning. You can see the terrain clearly, which I value. No surprises in the landscape, or fewer of them. The trade-off is the short days and the cold that comes in fast once the sun drops below the ridgeline. I'd accounted for both. I had the right gear and I wasn't planning any heroics. The first 2 days were what I'd come for. Good miles, good weather for November, the particular pleasure of a forest that's had its crowds thin out to nothing. I saw a black bear on the second morning at a distance, 2 deer, a grouse that nearly gave me a heart attack when it flushed from the undergrowth 3 feet from my left boot. No other people, no evidence of other people. The backcountry in November has a quality of absolute vacancy that I find more restoring than almost anything else I know. I found the cabin on the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, when the light was already going amber and I was starting to think about where I'd make camp. I almost missed the turnoff entirely. I'd been following a faint path that contoured around the south slope of a knoll, something that might have been a trail once, and was now just a line of slightly less resistance through the undergrowth. And the cove hollow that the cabin sat in was screened by a stand of hemlocks, so old and dense that even in November, with the hardwoods bare, you couldn't see through it. The hemlocks held their needles year-round, and they'd grown together over the decades into something close to a wall. In summer, it would have been completely invisible. What stopped me was the smell. I noticed it first as wood smoke, which I registered and kept walking, because wood smoke in the backcountry can carry a long way, and I had no particular reason to investigate the source. Then I noticed the second layer of it, something underneath the smoke that was food. Not the abstract smell of something burning, but the specific smell of something cooked, a savory warmth that was incongruous with where I was and what I'd expected to find there. 11 days since the last trail registration. Temperatures had been in the low 30s overnight. I shouldn't have been smelling cooked food. I stopped and stood still for a moment. Then I took a few steps back along the path to where the hemlock screen had a narrow gap, barely wide enough to push through, and I pushed through it. The clearing on the other side was small, maybe 60 feet across, irregular, the hemlocks pressing in from 3 sides and the slope rising behind the cabin on the 4th. The cabin itself was set against the slope, a low structure with a stone foundation and a metal roof and a stone chimney, from which a thin thread of smoke was still rising. The smoke was not from a current fire. It was the residual drift that comes from coals, from a fire that had been burning until recently and had burned down to its end. The thread was thin and pale, and it rose without dispersing in the still cold air of the hollow. I stood at the edge of the hemlock screen and looked at the cabin for a long time. The windows had glass, and the glass was mostly intact. The door was closed. Nothing moved in the clearing or around the structure. The hemlock grove was completely silent in the way that dense conifers absorb sound. There was no wind noise, no bird sound, no distant traffic. The only thing I could hear was the slight sound of my own breathing. I walked across the clearing and tried the door. It opened without resistance. No lock, no resistance, just a wooden door on functional hinges that swung inward when I pushed it. I stood in the doorway and looked inside before I stepped in, giving my eyes a moment to adjust to the interior dimness. The cabin was clean. That was the first thing that registered, and the thing that stayed with me through everything else, the cleanliness of it. I've been in a lot of abandoned backcountry structures over 20 years of hiking that range, and they have a universal quality of neglect that you expect and that this cabin did not have. No debris on the floor, no accumulated leaves blown in through gaps. The surfaces were free of the grime and animal sign that empty structures accumulate. The stone hearth on the right wall had coals in it that were still faintly orange at their centers. When I looked at them directly, a fire burned down over the last several hours from something substantial. The room was warm, noticeably warmer than the outside air. There was a table against the far wall. 3 bowls, ceramic, the kind of heavy stoneware that gets passed down and used until it breaks, each one different from the others, in a way that suggested they'd come from different sources over different years, rather than being a matched set. 3 wooden spoons, 1 in each bowl. I crossed the room and stood in front of the table and looked at the bowls. Each one had the remains of a meal in it, something stew-like. The liquid mostly absorbed or consumed, root vegetables visible, the residue on the sides of the bowls that you get when something has been eaten but not finished. I held my hand over the nearest bowl without touching it. Warm. Not hot, not fresh from the stove warm, but the kind of warmth that food retains for an hour or so after it's been served. 3 chairs were pushed back from the table at slightly different angles. Not pushed in, not arranged. Pushed back, the way chairs look when people have stood up from them and not returned. One was pushed back farther than the others, turned slightly, as if whoever had been sitting in it had left quickly. I looked at the rest of the room. A shelf with a small collection of items, a lantern, 2 candles, some folded cloth that might have been dish towels, a wooden box under the shelf that I didn't open. Everything functional, nothing decorative, the interior of a place that was being used as a place to live rather than a place to visit. There was a loft, a simple board loft over the back third of the cabin, accessible by a fixed ladder nailed to the rear wall. I stood at the base of the ladder and looked up into it. 3 bedrolls, laid out side by side on the loft floor. Each one had been folded back from the top, the way you fold back a sleeping bag when you get up in the morning or when you get up in the middle of the night. Not packed, not rolled, just folded back, as if the people who had been in them had gotten up and intended to return. The impressions of 3 bodies were visible in the compressed fill of the bedrolls. I stood at the base of that ladder for a long time and processed what I was looking at. 3 people lived here, or were staying here, or had been here until very recently. The coals in the hearth, the warmth of the food, the folded back bedrolls, the timeline, all suggested the same window. Within the last hour or two, 3 people had been in this cabin, eaten a meal at this table, and left, or had been somewhere I couldn't see them. I turned and looked at the door I'd come through. Still open, the gray November light coming in from the clearing. I looked at the windows. The glass was too dark and too dirty to see through from the inside. I had no idea what was in the hemlock grove on the other side of those windows. I stood in that cabin and listened. The coals in the hearth made a faint settling sound once a small click of contracting stone. Somewhere outside, distant enough to be at the edge of audibility, a branch moved, or something moved a branch. In the dense silence of that hemlock hollow, I could not tell the difference. I backed toward the door. Not quickly, I want to be accurate about this. I did not flee. I moved deliberately, keeping my eyes on the windows and the loft and the shadows in the corners of the room. I found the doorway behind me and stepped through it and pulled the door closed. I don't know why I pulled it closed. Some instinct toward leaving things as I'd found them, toward not announcing to whoever returned that someone had been inside. I crossed the clearing without running, I pushed back through the hemlock gap and stood on the path on the other side and breathed. The cold outside the hemlock screen was immediate and clarifying after the warmth of the cabin. I stood and looked in both directions along the path. Empty. I made camp 2 miles south that night, on a exposed ridgeline where I could see in all directions and where the wind would carry sounds up from below. I didn't sleep well. Every time I came close, I heard the sound of 3 chairs pushed back from a table at slightly different angles, and I thought about the bedrolls folded back in that loft, and I thought about the fact that when I'd stood in that clearing and listened, I had heard nothing. Not the movement of 3 people in a hemlock forest. Not voices, not footsteps, not the sounds of people who'd just gotten up from their dinner. Nothing. As if the hollow had simply absorbed them. As if they'd been there and then, between one moment and the next, had not been. I cleared the trailhead by noon the following day. I drove for an hour before I stopped for food and sat in a booth and ordered coffee, and something I don't remember eating, and stared out a window at a parking lot and thought about 3 mismatched bowls, and 3 chairs, and 3 bedrolls with the warmth still in them. I've told this story twice. Both times, the person I told it to asked me the same question, which was whether I thought the people had seen me coming and hidden. It's a reasonable question, and I've considered it carefully. The hemlocks are dense enough to hide in. People who live in the backcountry outside of normal patterns sometimes avoid contact by choice. It's possible. What I can't account for in that explanation is how 3 people moved through a hemlock grove in absolute silence in dry November conditions, with dead leaves on the ground and branches at face level, and produced no sound I could detect. That's the part I come back to. Not what I saw, what I didn't hear. I've been in construction for 23 years, residential and light commercial, and the way I look at buildings is genuinely different from how most people look at them. It's not something I consciously do anymore, it's just how the visual field organizes itself when I'm near a structure. I see the framing decisions before I see the aesthetic ones. I notice how a corner was handled, how a roof was pitched, where the builder compromised and where they didn't. Old structures interest me particularly because they tell you something about how people thought about problems before the industry standardized everything into sameness. Every old cabin in the Virginia mountains is a record of specific decisions made by a specific person with specific materials and specific knowledge, and I find that record worth reading. My colleague Dennis had mentioned the cabin in passing, the way people mention things they've half noticed and don't think much about. Said he'd seen a collapsed structure off a fire road near the peaks of Otter when he'd been out turkey hunting the previous fall. Said it looked old. Said the front of it was still standing. I filed it the way I file those things, and on a Saturday in early October, when I had no particular obligations, I put it in my truck and drove out. The fire road was gated but not locked. A Forest Service gate with a standard cable closure that you loop off the post, and I drove in about 1.5 miles before I saw what Dennis had described. The cabin was set maybe 30 yards off the right side of the road in a stand of second-growth oak, visible now that the canopy was thinning toward fall but probably well screened in summer. I pulled over and got out and walked to it. The collapse Dennis had described was real and significant. The entire rear wall had failed and pulled a section of the roof down with it. The logs splayed outward where the corner notching had finally given way. The roof decking and what remained of the metal sheeting folded down into the interior at the back. It would have made a substantial sound when it went. The front half of the structure was intact, the 2 front walls and the front portion of the roof still standing and still reasonably solid, the collapse having somehow sheared off the back without destabilizing the front. This happens sometimes with log construction. When the failure is slow enough, the wood settles rather than falls, and the remaining sections can hold for years. I walked the perimeter first, which is what I always do. Reading the exterior before the interior tells you things that the interior will then either confirm or complicate. The construction was what I'd guessed from the road 1920s or thereabouts, possibly earlier, log walls with the corner style I associate with that period in that region. The workmanship was honest. Whoever built it knew what they were doing, had probably built before, and had access to good timber. The foundation was stone, dry stacked, still reasonably plumb at the front corners. The chimney was down, the stones scattered in the collapsed rear section, but you could see from the intact front wall where it had been. The windows. Both front windows had been boarded from the inside. I could see this because the boarding was visible through the gaps at the window frame edges, rough-cut lumber, placed against the glass from inside, and held there by pressure or nailing, the exterior glass still intact in both frames. Windows boarded from inside rather than outside is not unusual in abandoned structures. People do it for various reasons: to slow deterioration, to keep animals out, because they're securing a space they plan to return to. I noted it and moved on. Then I got to the door. The front door was a plank door, the original, the wood gray and weathered and checking along the grain but still solid. It was in its frame. It appeared, from the front, simply closed. No visible damage, no obvious modification. What made me stop was the gap. Old doors and old frames develop gaps as the wood moves over decades, and this door had a gap along the latch side of maybe 3/8 of an inch, wide enough that when I put my flashlight to it and angled the beam inside, I could see the interior of the door and the frame behind it. I saw the nails, large cut nails, the kind that predates wire nails, driven through the door at angles into the frame from the interior side. Not one or two, I counted at least 8 in the section of the gap I could illuminate, and the gap only covered maybe 18 inches of the door's height. They'd been driven in a pattern, spaced deliberately, angled so that the points bit into the frame and the heads were tight against the door face. This was not someone nailing a board over an opening. This was someone nailing the door itself into its frame from inside, systematically, with the intention of making it impossible to open from either side. I stood with my flashlight against the gap for a long time. Then I straightened up and stood in front of the door and thought through what this meant structurally and logistically. To nail a door shut from the inside, you have to be inside. You have to have a hammer and nails, which means you came prepared to do this or you found them there. You do the work from inside the closed door, which means when you're done, the door is sealed and you're on the interior side of it. To then not be on the interior side of it, you need another way out. I went back around the perimeter, slowly this time, looking at everything. The 2 front windows still boarded, glass intact, no sign of disturbance at the frames. The collapsed rear section, I picked my way carefully into the debris, watching my footing on the fallen logs and roofing material. The rear wall was down and the roof was down, and theoretically the collapse had created openings. But I was looking at the collapse not as a way out, but as a pre-existing feature, because the nails I'd seen were not new. The rust on them matched the surrounding hardware on the door, which put them at decades old at minimum, which put them well before the collapse. Whatever had been done to that door had been done when the cabin was intact. I looked at the intact floor sections visible through the collapsed rear. Wide plank flooring, the planks running parallel to the front wall. I went around to where the collapse had exposed the floor edge and crouched and looked at the underside of the planks. The foundation was stone, with no crawl space to speak of. The floor joists were sitting almost directly on the foundation stones, maybe 8 inches of clearance, not enough for a person. I went back to the front and stood in front of the door again. No second door, no hatch, no window that had been opened and resecured, no gap in the walls large enough for a person to pass through, and the chinking, while deteriorated, had been intact when the nailing was done. I could tell from the weathering patterns that the current gaps were the product of slow deterioration over decades, not forced openings that had resettled. The cabin, at the time someone nailed that door shut from the inside, had been effectively sealed. 1 door, 2 boarded windows, a tight floor, walls in good repair. Someone had sealed themselves inside and then was not inside. I went back to the door gap and put the flashlight to it again, and spent a long time looking at what I could see of the interior. The angle was narrow, and the flashlight only illuminated a slice of the space, but I moved it around and built up a fragmented picture. Floor planks, the base of what might have been a table or a shelf on the far wall, a scatter of objects I couldn't identify at that angle, and in that light, and on the floor near the door, close to the door, close enough that I could see it clearly, a scattering of cut nails, loose, a small pile of them, as if someone had set them out before using them, sorted them from a supply, prepared their materials before beginning the work. The nails were sorted. Whoever had done this had prepared, had thought about it before doing it, had organized their materials on the floor of the cabin, and then nailed the door shut, nail by nail from inside, and then by every physical indicator available to me had ceased to be in the room. I've gone back to this several times in the years since, turning it over the way you turn over a construction problem, looking for the solution I've missed. I've thought about hidden spaces I might have overlooked, a false section of wall, a concealed door, something the collapse might have revealed that I hadn't recognized as significant. I've thought about whether the rear wall collapse itself could have created an exit, but the timeline is wrong. I've thought about whether the nails could have been driven from outside through some method I'm not imagining, but that's not physically how it works with cut nails at those angles in that wood. I found one reference to the property in county records. It was a land grant parcel that passed through several owners between the 1880s and 1940s, and then appears to have been absorbed into national forest land without a clear record of the last private transfer. The last name associated with it before the absorption was a family name I recognized as local to that part of the county. I made one attempt to find anyone connected to that name and came up against the particular silence that old rural families sometimes leave behind. Not the absence of records, but the absence of anyone still connected to the records who will speak about them. I'm a practical person. I deal in load-bearing walls and foundation, drainage, and material tolerances. I do not deal in things I can't explain. And yet here is the thing I can't explain. A door nailed shut from the inside of a sealed room, and no one inside it. I drove back out the fire road that afternoon and sat in my truck at the gate for a while before I closed it behind me. I've driven past the fire road entrance maybe a dozen times since, on my way to other jobs in that part of the county. I've never turned in again. Dennis asked me once if I'd found the cabin and what I thought of it. I told him the construction was interesting. He seemed satisfied with that. Some problems don't have solutions. In my line of work, that's usually a sign that you've identified the problem wrong, that there's a factor you haven't accounted for. I've tried to find the missing factor in this one for years. I've started to think the missing factor isn't structural. I teach 4th grade, which means I have spent the better part of 16 years immersed in the visual language of children. I know it the way a musician knows an instrument, not just the notes, but the vocabulary, the grammar of it, the specific conventions that children across cultures and backgrounds arrive at independently when they put crayon or marker to paper. The round head with the face features floating in it. The body is a rectangle or a line. Arms emerging from the sides of the head before the concept of shoulders develops. Legs as parallel lines descending from the torso. Feet as horizontal extensions. The sun in the upper corner, almost always the upper right, with its radiating lines. The house as a square with a triangle roof and a centered door. These are not taught. They emerge, and they emerge with a consistency that still strikes me as remarkable after all these years of seeing it. Children who have never met each other, who have grown up in different homes, speaking different languages, produce drawings that are recognizably from the same visual tradition. I know this language. I know its range and its limits and its particular emotional register. I know the difference between a child's drawing made in pleasure and one made in fear, and I know what it looks like when a child draws something they have seen rather than something they have imagined. I want to establish this before I describe what I found in that cabin, because I think my professional background is the reason I understood what I was looking at, and the reason I wish, sometimes, that I hadn't. The Tanyard Gap Trail is not heavily used even in season, and I was on it in early April, which is before most people have started thinking about hiking in that part of the Blue Ridge. The trees were barely budding, the trail surface still soft from winter, the air cold enough in the morning that I could see my breath. I'd taken a long weekend to do a section I'd been wanting to complete. Nothing ambitious, a 2-night out and back with a layover at a backcountry site I'd used once before. The first day went without incident. The second morning I took a side trail I hadn't taken before, a faint path marked on my topo that dropped off the main trail toward a creek drainage, and about a mile down it I found the cabin. It was set in a flat area beside the creek, sheltered by the slope above it and by a stand of white pine that would make it nearly invisible from the trail in summer. In April, with the pines providing the only real cover, it was visible from maybe 40 feet out, a small structure, 1 story, log walls with a metal roof that had failed in sections, the gaps letting daylight through in places. The door was closed but unlatched, swinging slightly in the air, moving up the drainage. I stood at the tree line and looked at it for a minute before I crossed to it. Nothing about the exterior gave me any particular concern. It looked like what it was, an old seasonal structure, probably a hunter's camp, abandoned some years ago. The logs were solid, the foundation stones still in reasonable position. I pushed the door open and looked inside. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, and then it took me another moment to accept that I was seeing it correctly. The floor was covered in children's drawings. Not one or two, not scattered. Every square inch of the wide plank flooring was covered, the drawings overlapping in layers. The newer ones laid over the older in an accumulation that suggested this had been happening for a long time and had been ongoing. The drawings were in crayon multiple colors, the waxy marks still vivid in the areas where the roof was intact, faded and smeared in the areas beneath the gaps where weather had gotten to them. I stepped inside carefully, moving toward the edges of the room to avoid stepping on the drawings at the center, and crouched down to look more closely. The first thing I confirmed was what I'd suspected from the doorway: these were made by children. The line quality, the representational conventions, the spatial reasoning, all placed the makers in a range I'd estimate at roughly 5 to 10 years old, with some variation suggesting either a range of ages or development over time from a single child. I know this range intimately. I spend my working days with children in it. What I was looking at had been made by a child or by children, and the crayon marks in the protected areas near the walls were still waxy and bright enough that at least some of this had been done within the past several months. Not years ago, months. I moved around the perimeter of the room and looked at the drawings more carefully. Most of them were standard childhood compositions, figures with round heads and lined bodies, trees rendered as circles on sticks, a sun in the corner, a house with a triangle roof. The universal vocabulary, unremarkable in isolation. But as I continued around the room, I began to notice the figure. It appeared in almost every drawing. Not every one, the oldest layers, the ones most faded and most covered by subsequent drawings, didn't always have it. But from a certain point onward, visible in drawing after drawing as I traced what appeared to be the chronological progression around the room, a tall figure, rendered in dark crayon, usually black or dark blue, standing at the edge of the tree line that appeared as a compositional element in most of the drawings. Trees were a consistent background element, the simple circle-on-stick convention, arranged in a row at the edge of the picture space. And at the edge of that tree line, in drawing after drawing, the tall figure, I need to describe it accurately. It was tall relative to the other figures in the compositions, disproportionately tall, twice or 3 times the height of the smaller figures that occupied the center of the pictures. It was rendered differently from the other figures, with more marks, more attention, as if the child or children drawing it had spent more time on it than on anything else. Where the other figures had the generic round head and line body simplicity of standard child drawings, the tall figure had more detail suggestions of a face, though the face was never clearly drawn, just marks where a face would be. Suggestions of arms, longer than they should have been, extending further than the proportions allowed. And it was always at the edge, always at the tree line, facing inward toward the smaller figures. In composition after composition, the same figure in the same position, the same orientation. I've had children who develop a recurring character in their drawings. It happens, particularly with imaginative children, a figure they return to across many works. But this wasn't that. This was specific. This was the same figure in the same position in drawing after drawing in a progression that I began, as I worked around the room, to understand as intentional. The drawings near the door were the last ones, the most recent. I'd left that section for last because the door had been open and the weather exposure from the door gap had faded them more than the rest. I crouched down and looked at them carefully in the available light. The tall figure was no longer at the tree line. In these drawings, 5 or 6 of them, the most recent, the crayon wax still holding the most color, the figure had moved. It was closer to the center of the composition, closer to the smaller figures. In the first of these recent drawings, it was perhaps halfway between the tree line and the smaller figures. In the next, it was closer. In the drawings after that, it was directly adjacent to the smaller figures, the long dark marks of its arms near the round heads of the smaller figures. In the last drawing, the one closest to the door, the one I looked at longest, the smaller figures were not there. Just the tall figure, centered in the composition, in the position where the smaller figures had been in all the preceding drawings. No tree line, no sun, no house. Nothing except the tall, dark figure rendered with more marks than any previous version, standing alone in the center of the page. I sat back on my heels and stayed in that position for a while. The rational explanations had presented themselves throughout, and I'd been running them in parallel with my observations, the way I do when something doesn't fit my expectations. Children in the area, coming to the cabin to play possible, but it required children to have access to this location, and the trail to it was not a casual walk, and the volume and consistency of the work suggested extended time over multiple visits that would require a level of access and privacy that was hard to account for. A single child returning repeatedly over a long period possible, but the variation in the drawing style suggested more than one maker, and the progression from the early layers to the recent ones showed developmental changes that suggested time passing, growth, a staged installation, someone's art project, or deliberate hoax possible, but the labor involved was significant. The crayon marks were genuine, and there was no evidence of adult intervention in the drawing style. I photographed everything. I spent more than an hour in that cabin, moving carefully around the edges of the room, documenting each section of floor. When I was done, I stood at the doorway and looked back at the space, the drawings covering every inch of the floor, the layer cake of color and image, the progression I'd traced from earliest to most recent, and the final drawing near my feet, with a single tall figure standing where the children had been. I closed the door behind me when I left. I don't know why that impulse came. I hadn't arrived to a closed door. I'd found it swinging open, but I closed it. Some instinct toward not leaving things exposed that I couldn't fully justify. I've shown the photographs to colleagues at my school. I've talked to the art teacher, who has more specific knowledge of child development in visual art than I do. She looked at the photographs for a long time. She confirmed what I'd already believed. These were genuine child-made drawings, not adult imitations. The developmental markers consistent with real childhood production. She looked at the tall figure and at its progression through the chronological sequence, and she said, quietly, that she hoped the children who had made these were somewhere other than wherever that figure was. I've tried to find any record of the cabin property ownership, usage history, anything in the county records that would tell me who had access to it and when. I haven't found anything useful. The land is national forest and has been for decades. What I can't stop thinking about is the last drawing. Not the absence of the smaller figures that's troubling, obviously, but it's the part that's easy to focus on because it's legible as a narrative. What I can't stop thinking about is the quality of the marks in that last drawing. The tall figure rendered with more attention, more marks, more time than in any previous version, as if whoever drew it had finally gotten close enough to see it clearly, as if they'd had, at the end, the clearest possible view. I've been a teacher for 16 years. I know what children draw when they draw something they've seen. I keep a list on my phone of structures I want to visit: old cabins, homesteads, industrial ruins, anything with enough history attached to it to make the trip worthwhile. It's a long list and I work through it slowly, because most of the locations require research and planning, and some of them require permissions or significant travel. The cabin on the north slope of Flat Top Mountain had been on the list for 2 years before I got to it, added after a correspondence with a local historian named Margaret, who I've been trading notes with for several years on the subject of abandoned structures in that part of the Blue Ridge. Margaret is meticulous and careful with language, which is why the way she described this particular cabin stayed with me. She mentioned it almost as an aside, in the middle of an email about a different property entirely, a single sentence noting that the Flat Top Hunting Lodge had been abandoned in the late 1940s, following what she called a dispute that ended badly. I wrote back and asked her to elaborate. She replied that she didn't have reliable details, that the record was thin and what she'd found was secondhand, and that she preferred not to repeat things she couldn't verify. I've known Margaret long enough to know that when she declines to repeat something, it's not because she doesn't have it. I noted it and added the cabin to the list, and eventually, on a Wednesday in late October, when I had a free day and the weather was clear, I drove out. The approach was harder than I'd anticipated. The access road that would have been maintained when the lodge was in use had been reclaimed almost completely by second-growth timber, and the shrub layer that fills in behind it, mountain laurel and dog hobble and young tulip, poplar. the kind of dense regrowth that can make a former road look like solid forest inside of 30 years. I found the road's ghost by the relative straightness of the line through the trees and the occasional suggestion of grading in the terrain, and I followed it until it crossed the creek, at which point I took my boots off and waded across and put them back on the other side and pushed into the second growth. About a mile of that, moving slowly, using my arms to hold the laurel back, before the structure appeared in a small clearing that the overgrowth hadn't fully taken yet. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. I'd expected worse. 2 years on my list with only a vague historical reference to go on, approached through a mile of dense regrowth off an access road that had effectively ceased to exist. I'd prepared myself for a ruin. What I found was something closer to a suspended structure, the kind that happens when conditions are right and maintenance stops, but the building itself was well enough made to resist deterioration longer than it should. The roof was intact, which is the single most important factor in a structure's survival, and whoever had built this one had built the roof well, a steep pitch with a generous overhang that had been shedding water away from the walls for 70 years, since the last person had bothered to care about it. The log walls were standing, plumb and solid at the corners. The chinking had failed in places, but the logs themselves were sound. The door was closed. I crossed the clearing and tried the door. Unlocked, closed, but not secured. The latch mechanism still functional enough to hold it shut against the weather. I opened it and went inside. The smell hit me before I'd fully crossed the threshold. I want to describe it accurately because I've smelled a lot of abandoned structures, and I know the range of what they produce. Rot has a particular smell, wet and sweet and vegetative. Mildew has its own register, that specific damp cellar quality. Animal occupation has another register, entirely the concentrated, ammoniac quality of a space where something has been eating and sleeping and leaving the evidence of both. What I smelled in the flat-top cabin was none of these exactly. It was biological, that's the word I keep coming back to. Biological, the smell of an enclosed space that has been occupied by something living. The residue of warmth and breath and presence. Not unclean exactly, just occupied. Like a room where someone has been sleeping. I stood inside the door and let my eyes adjust and breathe through my mouth for a moment before I started looking around. The interior was a single large room with a loft. The loft accessible by a ladder nailed to the rear wall. A stone hearth on the east end, cold and long unused. The interior of it showing the blackened residue of many fires from decades past. A plank floor, solid, the board's old-growth chestnut that hadn't been available for new construction since the blight took the trees in the early 20th century. Rough furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf, all of it original to the structure, left behind when the lodge was abandoned, and still there, though the chair seats had given out and the shelf had pulled from the wall on one side and tilted. Standard for a space that had been closed for 70 years. The walls were chestnut planking, the boards run vertically from floor to ceiling, original to the structure. In good condition for their age, the intact roof had kept the moisture off them, and chestnut is exceptionally rot-resistant, one of the reasons it was the building material of choice in the mountains before the blight. I moved around the room looking at everything with the attention I bring to these spaces, touching the walls, checking the floor for soft spots, reading the record of the structure. The north wall was where I stopped. Something had worked at it from inside the wall cavity. I want to be precise about what I mean by this. The wall construction was a double layer, the chestnut planking on the interior face, then the log exterior wall behind it, with a cavity between them that would have been used for minimal insulation, perhaps packed with moss or sawdust, when the structure was new and long since settled and compressed. The planking on the interior face had been pushed outward from behind, the boards stressed and cracked in a pattern consistent with sustained pressure applied from within the cavity. Not a single impact sustained pressure. The kind of force that accumulates over time and eventually overcomes the wood's resistance. A section roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall had been worked loose enough that the planks had bowed outward from the cavity, creating a gap at the top of the section where the wood had cracked along the grain and the planking had separated from the framing behind it. The gap at the top was about 2 inches at its widest. I stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time before I put my hand near it. Then I did put my hand near it, not touching the wood but holding my palm close to the gap. It was warm. Not the ambient temperature of the room, which was the cool, of a closed space in October. Warm in the specific way that enclosed spaces become warm when something warm has been in them, the residual heat of occupation. Whatever had been in that wall cavity had been there recently enough that the heat was still in the wood. The cavity between the chestnut planking and the exterior log wall was perhaps 8 to 10 inches deep, and the section that had been worked loose was 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, which made it large enough, just large enough for something significant to have been inside it. I stepped back and looked at the section as a whole. The pressure damage started at about knee height and went up to above my head, which placed the applied force in the middle section of the cavity. The cracks in the wood radiated from a central area of the bowed section, which is consistent with pressure applied at a central point rather than distributed across the whole surface. Something had been in there, pressing against the planking, at a point roughly 4 feet off the floor, at about the height that something large would press against a surface if it were oriented with its body parallel to the wall. I put my flashlight to the crack at the top of the gap and looked into the cavity. I could see, in the narrow slice of space the flashlight illuminated, the interior surface of the exterior log wall and the compressed remains of what had been the insulating material, dark, fibrous, matted down over decades. And I could see, in the matted material, an impression. The compressed and shaped absence of something that had rested there long enough to leave its form in the fibrous mass, the way a body leaves a form in a mattress over time. The impression was large. It was oriented vertically along the cavity. Whatever had made it had been resting there, pressed against the interior face of the planking, for long enough that the insulation had conformed to its shape. I took my flashlight away from the gap and stood in the middle of the room and thought. The smell. The warmth still in the wood, the impression in the insulation, the damage pattern consistent with pressure applied from inside the cavity over time. The door closed but unlocked when I arrived. I worked through what these things added up to, and I came to the same place. Every time something had been in the wall of this cabin, had been there recently, had been there long enough to shape its environment, and was not there now. I went back to the door and opened it and looked at the clearing and the overgrowth around it. The second growth was dense and close on all sides. Whatever had been in the wall would have left through the exterior. I looked at the outside of the north wall and found what I'd been expecting, a section of the exterior chinking that had been removed, a gap between two of the lower logs wide enough to allow access to the wall cavity from outside. The gap was at ground level. The edges of the logs around it were smooth, worn smooth, the way wood gets worn when something passes over it repeatedly. I stood at the north wall and looked at the tree line beyond the clearing, and I thought about what I knew about the cabin, the abandonment in the late 1940s, the dispute that ended badly, the thing Margaret had declined to repeat because she couldn't verify it, and I thought about how long the impression in the insulation would take to form, and what would make a pattern of pressure damage like what I'd seen. In the chestnut planking, I went back inside. I climbed the ladder to the loft and looked at the loft floor. The dust up there was thick and largely undisturbed, except in one area near the loft edge, near the top of the ladder, where the dust had been disturbed in a pattern that suggested something had rested there and looked down into the room below. The view from that spot was of the entire main room, of the door, of anyone who entered. I climbed back down. I picked up my pack from where I'd set it near the door, and I left. I didn't run. I walked across the clearing at a measured pace and went back into the second growth and retraced my route to the creek crossing and waded back across and found my car. I've emailed Margaret twice since, once asking her to tell me what she hadn't told me about the dispute in the 1940s, once asking if she knew anything about the history of the north wall of the structure. She hasn't replied to either email. We had corresponded regularly for 4 years before that. The silence is its own kind of answer. The warmth in that wood is the thing I can't let go of. Everything else I can find explanations for that are incomplete but survivable. The warmth I can't. The fire in that hearth had been cold for 70 years. The October air was in the low 40s. The wall was warm. Something had been in that cavity recently enough to leave its heat in the wood, and whatever it was had been there long enough to press its shape into the insulation, and when I arrived it had moved somewhere I couldn't see. I've started to think the loft is where it went, that it climbed the ladder while I was standing at the north wall with my flashlight against the gap, that it was above me while I processed what I was looking at, that the impression in the loft dust was not from a previous visit, but from the hour I spent in that cabin working through what the wall was telling me. I don't know what was living in that wall. I don't know what the dispute in the 1940s was, or how it ended, or what connection it has to what I found. I know that something warm had been in a wall cavity in a closed cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that it was no longer there when I left. I know that I didn't look up at the loft when I walked out. I've thought about that every day since. I wasn't supposed to be at that shelter at all. My plan for the day had been to push through to the next designated campsite, another 4 miles south, which would have put me on schedule for finishing the section the following afternoon. I'd been making good time all morning, the kind of hiking where the miles come easy and the body settles into its rhythm and you stop thinking about distance and just move. The storm changed the calculation. It had been building since I left camp at 7, the sky doing that thing where it darkens by degrees so gradually that you keep thinking it's not going to amount to anything, that it'll pass to the north the way these systems sometimes do along the ridge. By 11, it was clear it wasn't passing anywhere. The clouds had lowered to the point where I was hiking through the ragged lower edge of them, the visibility forward dropping to a few hundred yards, and the temperature had come down 10 degrees in 2 hours. The first serious rain hit around noon, not the tentative start of something, but the full commitment. Horizontal off the southwest, the kind of rain that finds every gap in your gear and exploits it. I checked my map. The emergency shelter was marked 2 miles back from where I wanted to end up, a small square symbol on the topo with the standard notation for a backcountry structure. I'd passed it before on a previous trip through this section and remembered it as solid log construction, metal roof, in decent repair for a facility that saw only occasional maintenance. 2 miles in this rain was 20 minutes. 4 miles to the planned campsite in this rain was the kind of decision you make when you're younger and have more to prove. I turned my hood up and moved. The shelter was where I remembered it, set about 30 yards off the trail on a short access path that was already running water down its center by the time I got to it. I pushed the door open and went inside and stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the interior while the rain worked on the metal roof overhead. The sound was tremendous, that amplified percussion that makes conversation impossible and thought difficult. I stood in it and let my eyes adjust and confirmed that I was alone and the structure was intact and I had made the right call. I got my wet layers off and hung them on the nails that someone had thoughtfully put in the wall near the door for exactly this purpose. I got my camp stove out and set it on the table and put water on for something hot, and only then, with the immediate requirements managed, started to actually look at where I was. Standard shelter configuration. 2 bunk platforms along the side walls, bare wood, the kind that invites a sleeping pad. A table in the center, scarred with decades of camp stove rings and knife marks and the general accumulated evidence of a surface that has been used hard by many people. A small shelf near the door, the traditional gathering place for things that hikers leave behind or leave for others, a small first aid item here. A forgotten piece of gear there, the occasional treat for whoever comes next. I looked at the shelf. 2 candle stubs, both burned well down. A rolled elastic bandage, the kind you use for a twisted ankle. A compass and a belt clip. I picked it up and checked the needle, which turned out to be magnetized wrong or damaged, spinning freely without settling on north. I set it back. And a composition notebook, the standard black cover variety. Its cardboard covers soft and slightly swollen, with absorbed humidity the way paper products get in shelters that see a lot of weather. I took the notebook to the table and sat down with my coffee and opened it from the back. Most shelter journals are what you expect them to be, and I've read enough of them to know the genre. Names and dates and trail names. Mileage reports. Brief weather observations. The occasional attempt at humor. Sometimes a drawing, sometimes a pressed flower or leaf taped to the page. The cumulative record of people passing through, each one adding a line or a paragraph to a document that nobody will ever read in full, but that feels important to contribute to anyway. Communal and minor, and entirely human. I paged back through recent entries looking for the last few, the most current. Most journals and shelters like this one accumulated a page or 2 a week in good hiking season, less in shoulder season. I was moving backward through October entries brief, a few lines each, the usual content when I hit a section that was different. The same handwriting. 20 pages, maybe slightly more, all from a single writer. I flipped to the first entry in this block, and checked the date 6 days before my arrival, which put it in late October, which was consistent with the season. The entry was a full page, dense but readable. The handwriting clear and unhurried. A description of the section of trail coming in from the north, weather conditions, a note about water sources. Completely standard. I read it with the comfortable attention you give something that's meeting your expectations. The second day's entry was similar. A deer seen near the creek in the morning. A description of a viewpoint on the ridge that the writer seemed moved by. A note about the temperature dropping and making camp earlier than planned. Normal. I paged forward. The third day was shorter, half a page. The handwriting was still the same person, but something in it had changed. Not the letter forms exactly, more the pressure of the pen against the paper. The letters pressed in more firmly, the strokes slightly more controlled in the way handwriting becomes controlled, when the writer is concentrating on the act of writing rather than on the content. The entry described a bad night's sleep, without specifying why, and a decision to stay at the shelter for a second night rather than moving on. I noted that and kept reading. Day 4 was a single paragraph. The handwriting had tightened further, the letters smaller and more deliberate, the line spacing reduced as if the writer were trying to use less of the page or were writing more carefully than usual. The content described poor weather, which matched the pattern I'd been hiking through, and a continued decision not to move. The writer mentioned having enough food for another 2 days. The paragraph ended normally, the sentence complete. Day 5 was different. It was also a single paragraph, but the paragraph was about sounds. Sounds outside the shelter at night. The writer described waking in the dark to something moving in the area around the shelter, not one clear sound, but a pattern of sounds, intermittent, that they'd been unable to attribute to any specific source. They'd sat up and listened, and the sounds had continued for what they estimated was an hour before stopping. They described having their headlamp on and having looked out the door and seen nothing. The writing at this point had a quality I recognized from papers I've read, where someone is working very hard to maintain a rational tone about something that has frightened them, careful word choices, an avoidance of interpretation, just the facts. But the facts were that someone had been alone in a backcountry shelter in late October and had spent an hour listening to sounds outside in the dark that they couldn't explain. I sat at the table with my coffee going cold, and I read that entry twice. Day 6. The date put it 4 days before my arrival. The entry was 3 lines. I read them. The first line said the sounds had come back the previous night and had been closer. The second line said something about the door. I read it 3 times, and each time I got something slightly different from it, which was the result of the handwriting having changed significantly from the previous days. The letters were larger now, slightly uneven, the pressure inconsistent, the kind of handwriting you produce when your hands are not entirely steady. The second line appeared to say something about the door not staying, or possibly not staying closed. The third line began mid-thought, no preamble, as if the writer had started writing in the middle of something they were thinking rather than beginning a new entry. The third line ended mid-sentence, not at the bottom of the page, not at a natural pause. In the middle, approximately 2/3 of the way across the line, where the sentence had been going somewhere and then stopped. And after the last letter, there was a mark, a long drag of the pen across the paper. Not a line, not a stroke, just the trailing mark of a pen that had moved sideways across the page, without being lifted, without intention, without control. The mark went to the right margin and stopped. I sat with the notebook open to that page for a long time. I looked at the date again, 4 days ago. I looked at the door of the shelter, which was closed. I thought about what was on the other side of it, which was the rain and the trail, and the several miles of Blue Ridge wilderness between here and the nearest road. I checked the bunk platforms, both bare. No gear, no sleeping pad, nothing left behind. Whoever had been writing in this journal had not left anything I could see except the journal itself. People forget things in shelters, it happens all the time. People also sometimes take everything with them when they leave. I couldn't tell which this was. I checked the door. The latch was functional, a simple wooden turn latch that held the door against the frame. I checked it several times. It worked. I didn't know what not staying meant in the context of the second line. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I ate my dinner and read the journal from the beginning, all of it, not just the last writer's entries. The entries before the 6-day block were exactly what I'd described: casual, brief, the normal content of a shelter journal. None of them mentioned sounds. None of them mentioned anything unusual about the shelter or the area around it. The 6-day block sat in the middle of the journal like a different document, different in tone and length and weight from everything around it. I slept on the right bunk with the journal on the table where I'd found it. I left my headlamp on its lowest setting clipped to the bunk frame because the dark in that shelter, with the rain on the roof making the outside world impossible to hear, was the kind of dark that encourages the imagination in directions that don't serve you. I woke twice. The first time, nothing. The second time, I lay still and listened for a long time before I concluded that what I'd heard was the rain-changing pattern on the roof as the wind shifted. I was moving at first light. I signed the journal before I left. Name, date, trail section, weather conditions, one line. I didn't write anything about the 6-day block or what I'd found in it. I don't know what I would have written. I set the journal back on the shelf and picked up my pack and opened the door and stepped out into a morning that had cleared overnight. The sky pale and cold and entirely ordinary. I've thought about who to tell and what to report. There was no name in the 6-day block of entries, just a trail name, the kind of alias that means nothing to a missing person's search. I've looked at trail registers for that section and found no obvious correlation. I've thought about calling the Forest Service and describing what I found, and realized that what I found is a journal entry that ends mid-sentence, which is unusual and troubling but is not, by itself, evidence of anything actionable. The drag mark across the paper, the way the pen had moved sideways without being lifted. I keep coming back to that. In 16 years of hiking, I've seen a lot of shelter journals. I've never seen one that ended that way. There are reasons a pen might move sideways across a page without intention, without control. I've thought about all of them. None of them are good. I found the cabin because of a wrong turn, which is how I've found some of the best things in 20 years of wandering the Blue Ridge with a camera and a topo map and no particular agenda. I'd been following a fire road that my map showed connecting to a trailhead I wanted to reach. And somewhere in the middle section the road forked in a way the map didn't account for, and I took the left fork because it looked more traveled, and it wasn't. It was less traveled, progressively, until it became a pair of ruts in the grass, and then it became a clearing at the edge of a stand of old hemlock, and in that clearing there was a cabin. I do this for a living, or close enough to it. I photograph abandoned structures for a combination of personal archive and occasional commercial use, regional publications, historical societies, that kind of thing. I've been inside more derelict buildings than I can accurately count. I have a systematic approach and a set of habits that I've developed specifically to keep the work from becoming careless, because careless is how people get hurt in old structures. You check the floor before you trust it. You look at the ceiling before you stand under it. You test anything you're going to put your weight on. You go slow and you pay attention. I parked at the edge of the clearing and sat in the truck for a minute, looking at the cabin before I got out. This is the first habit, the one that costs nothing and occasionally tells you something useful. The structure was single-story, log construction, a metal roof that was intact and had probably been replaced at some point in the cabin's history, given that the logs looked older than the roofing. A stone chimney on the right side, missing its top 2 feet but otherwise standing. 2 windows, both intact, the glass original, and so old it had the slight waviness of period glass. A door, closed. The clearing was modest, maybe 60 feet across, the hemlock pressing in on 3 sides, and the slope dropping away behind the cabin on the 4th. No other structures. No evidence of recent vehicle traffic except my own ruts in the grass. I got out and walked the exterior before I went inside, which is the second habit. I'm looking at the foundation, the wall condition, the roof edge, the state of the window frames, reading the structure's integrity before I commit to entering it. This cabin read as solid. The foundation stones were in good position, the corner notching was tight, no visible wall lean or foundation shift. The door frame was plumb, the windows hadn't cracked. Someone had built this well, and the roof replacement had kept the worst of the moisture out long enough for the bones of it to stabilize in their aged state, rather than continuing to deteriorate. I've been in structures that looked worse and were safer, and structures that looked better and weren't. This one I judged as low risk. I tried the door. Unlocked, which is common. There's nothing in these old hunting cabins worth stealing, and locals generally know it. and the locks corrode and fail anyway over decades of disuse. The door opened inward on hinges that were stiff but functional, and I went inside. Single room, the layout I'd expected from the exterior. A wood stove against the right wall, cast iron, old enough to predate most of the ones I've photographed, the legs and body showing a design style I associate with the first quarter of the 20th century. A bunk platform along the left wall, the kind built into the structure rather than freestanding, the boards worn smooth by decades of use. A shelf on the back wall with a few items on it, an old tin, a folded piece of cloth, something I couldn't identify at that distance, a table, and a single chair near the stove. The floor was plank, solid when I tested it, the boards wide and tight-fitting in the way of old-growth lumber. I spent about 10 minutes making my initial assessment, moving around the room, testing surfaces, reading the space. In my professional attention, I was cataloging light angles for the photographs I'd be taking, identifying the structural details that were worth documenting, thinking about the sequence I'd work through. The stove was excellent, the kind of piece that photographs beautifully, all mass and functional severity. The bunk platform had good texture. The shelf would need some work with a secondary light source. I was thinking about the shelf when I turned to check the door latch, a routine thing, making sure I could get out the way I came in, and the door hadn't shifted on its hinges behind me. I turned with my flashlight, and the beam went to the latch, and then moved upward, following the door frame, and caught the photographs. 3 of them, nailed directly into the log above the door frame, not framed, not mounted on backing the photographs themselves. Nailed at the corners with small finish nails driven through the print into the wood. They were black and white, the paper aged to that particular ivory yellow that old photographic paper becomes. The surfaces slightly glossy in the way of prints from that era, the edges curled where the corners had lifted over time. I crossed to the door and looked at them without touching them. The first photograph was a landscape, a field in the foreground, a tree line behind it, the quality of light suggesting early morning or late afternoon. It could have been anywhere in the Blue Ridge, nothing specific enough to identify a location, just the universal grammar of that landscape. Unremarkable. The second photograph was the cabin, taken from the clearing outside, from far enough back to get the full structure and frame with some of the surrounding trees visible at the edges. I recognized it immediately, the roof line, the chimney placement, the window positions. The photograph had been taken in summer, the hemlock around the clearing full and pressing in closer than it appeared now, the clearing itself smaller in the image than it was in October when I was standing in it. The cabin in the photograph looked the same as the cabin I was standing in. No differences I could identify. The same structure, the same condition, the same door. I looked at the third photograph. It was an interior shot. Taken from the doorway, I could determine from the angle the photographer standing at the threshold and pointing the camera into the room. The image showed the same room I was standing in. The stove in the same position on the right wall. The bunk platform on the left. The shelf on the back wall. Nothing in the room had changed between when this photograph was taken and the moment I was looking at it. Not one thing. The stove was in the same position. The shelf held what appeared to be the same items. The bunk was in the same condition. In the center of the room, in the third photograph, there was a figure. I looked at it for a long time before I did anything else. The figure was standing in the middle of the room, facing the camera, centered in the frame, positioned as if they had placed themselves there deliberately, had stood in that spot and faced the door and waited for the photograph to be taken. The image quality was limited old film, indoor lighting conditions that would have been poor for photography, the print aged and slightly degraded, but the figure was visible as a presence rather than as a clearly defined person. A human shape, standing, facing forward, looking at the camera, looking at whoever was in the doorway taking the photograph, looking, from the framing, directly at the door. I looked at the spot in the room where the figure had been standing, the center of the room, roughly equidistant from all 4 walls. I was standing approximately 4 feet from it. I looked at the photograph, and then at the spot, and then at the photograph again. I took the photographs down carefully, working the nails out of the log with a multi-tool I carry. I turned them over one at a time and looked at the backs. The first 2 had nothing, blank paper, aged and slightly mottled. The third, the interior shot, had a date stamp, the kind that photo processing labs used to apply when they printed film, a red stamp with the processing date. I read it twice to make sure I had it right. I set the photographs on the table and stood in the room and looked at everything slowly. The stove, the bunk, the shelf, the floor, the windows. Nothing had changed since 1987. I could use the photograph as a before and after and find no differences. 30-something years and the room was identical, which meant that no one had used this cabin since 1,987 inches any way that rearranged or removed anything, which meant that no one had been here, or that whoever had been here had been careful to leave things exactly as they'd found them, every time, for 3 decades. I went back to the third photograph and looked at the figure again, standing in the center of the room in 1987, facing the door. I tried to extract detail from the image that the image didn't quite have, whether the figure was male or female, what they were wearing, any identifying feature. The print quality and the age of the photograph gave me an outline and a posture and nothing else. A person standing still facing forward in this room, in this exact spot 30-something years ago. I set up my camera and documented the cabin the way I always do, methodically, every surface, every detail. I photographed the spot above the door frame where the 3 nails were still embedded in the wood. I photographed the photographs themselves on the table. I worked through it with the professional attention I always bring, and I didn't think too hard about anything until I was done and packing up. Then I stood in the center of the room, in the spot where the figure had been standing in the third photograph, and I turned and faced the door. The framing was right. From this position, someone at the door with a camera would have had me centered in their frame. The stove over my right shoulder, the bunk over my left, the shelf behind me on the back wall. This was the spot. I was standing in it. I looked at the door and thought about who had been in the doorway in 1987 with a camera, and who had been standing where I was standing, and which of those 2 people had nailed the photographs above the door before they left. And I thought about the fact that whoever had nailed the photographs there had included the interior shot, had included the image of the person standing in the center of the room, had chosen to put that particular photograph above the door, where anyone entering the cabin would be standing directly below it, had chosen to put it there so that anyone who found it would understand that someone had stood in this room before them, had stood in this spot, had faced this door. I left the photographs on the table. I don't know why I didn't take them. Professional habit usually runs the other way. I document and preserve. I left them because putting them back above the door felt wrong, and taking them felt like taking something that wasn't mine, and leaving them on the table felt like the only option that didn't require a decision I wasn't ready to make. I drove out the fire road in the late afternoon light and found the fork I'd misread on the way in, and took the right branch this time and found the trailhead I'd originally been looking for. The third photograph is the one I keep returning to. Not the figure itself, the position of the figure, centered, still, facing the door. The posture of someone who knew the photograph was being taken and had arranged themselves for it. The posture of someone waiting. I've been back to the clearing twice. Both times the cabin has been locked to padlock. I don't remember being there the first time. A current model, no rust. Both times I've stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the structure and thought about the photographs on the table inside and about the figure in the third one, standing in the center of the room. I haven't tried the door again. I think whoever put that padlock there did it for a reason. I think the reason might be the same reason the photographs were nailed above the door in the first place, so that whoever came next would know. Dex and I have a shorthand that developed over 12 years of hiking together, the kind of communication that stops needing words after enough shared miles. A look that means slow down, a hand signal that means stop and listen, the particular way one of us will pause on the trail and the other will read the pause without being told what it means. You build that with someone through accumulated experience, through the creek crossing that was higher than expected, through the storm that came in faster than the forecast, through the navigation error at dusk that required a calm head and a good compass, and the willingness to admit the mistake without drama. 12 years of that, and you develop a fluency with another person that is specific and reliable, and that I've never quite replicated with anyone else. I tell you this because what happened on the second afternoon of the Blue Ridge trip was a communication of that kind, wordless, immediate, mutually understood, and I want you to understand that it wasn't the product of one person's anxiety infecting another. Wasn't one of us leading and the other following. It was simultaneous. We arrived at the same understanding at the same moment through what felt like the same channel, and that simultaneity is the thing I've thought about most in the years since. The trip had been straightforward up to that point. 3 days planned in a section of the Blue Ridge we'd talked about doing for a couple of years, but hadn't gotten around to good elevation, good views, a stretch of trail that connected two areas we knew well, through a middle section neither of us had covered. We'd started on a Tuesday to avoid the weekend traffic, and by the second afternoon we had the trail entirely to ourselves, which was what we'd been hoping for. The weather had cooperated. The first night had been cold but clear, and we'd had that particular satisfaction of a camp that works, food that's hot, a fire that catches the first time, sleep that comes easy after honest miles. The second day we made good time along the ridge. The trail ran the spine in that section, open enough in places for long views west into the valley and east toward the Piedmont, the kind of hiking that reminds you why you bother with the approach. By early afternoon we were ahead of the pace I'd planned, which put us in the comfortable position of having time to spend without any pressure to move. We stopped on a high point just after 2 and ate something, and looked at the terrain below us on the west side. It was Dex who spotted the roofline. He was looking west with his binoculars, the habit he has of scanning terrain we're about to move through, and he said there was a structure in the trees below us, about half a mile down the slope, maybe 2/3 of the way into the drainage. I took the binoculars and found it a roofline, just visible through the canopy, the angle of a peak against the background of the slope beyond. Metal roof, from the color. The trees around it were dense enough that the structure itself was mostly hidden, just that angle of roof suggesting the rest. We had time. The weather was holding, and our campsite for the night was a straightforward 2 hours from where we were, and there was no reason not to go look. This is the thing we do. Dex and I, we deviate for things worth investigating. We've always given ourselves that latitude. It's part of why we plan margins into our days. I said sure, and we packed up and started down the west side of the ridge. The descent took longer than the distance suggested, because the slope was steep and the undergrowth was thick, in the way of terrain that doesn't see trail traffic. The kind of bushwhacking where you're picking your way through mountain laurel and greenbrier and the occasional stand of young tulip poplar that has filled in every available space. We went slow and deliberate, keeping the roofline in our general bearing when we could see it, and navigating by slope and drainage when we couldn't. It took us close to 40 minutes to cover what would have been a 20-minute walk on maintained trail. The clearing appeared below us as we came down through the last section of dense timber. We stopped at the upper edge of it, where the tree line broke, and stood looking at the cabin from roughly 40 feet out. I want to describe what we saw accurately and completely, because the accurate and complete description is the thing that makes what happened next so difficult to explain. The cabin was a single-story log structure, the logs dark with age, but the walls standing and plumb. The metal roof I'd seen from the ridge was intact. No obvious gaps or failures. A stone chimney on the right side, intact to the cap. A door, closed. 2 windows, both intact. A small porch, covered, the boards weathered but not collapsed. The clearing around it was modest, the grass and low shrubs of a space that had been open for years but wasn't maintained. A rusted metal item near the left corner of the structure, a wash tub or a basin of some kind, sitting in the grass. Everything looked normal. That's the word Dex used when we talked about it later, carefully, the one time we've come close to discussing it directly. Normal. A normal abandoned mountain cabin, in a normal clearing, on a normal October afternoon, with good light and no weather coming. Nothing wrong with any of it. And we both stopped. Not one after the other. Not me first and then Dex following my lead. Or Dex first and me reading his hesitation. We stopped at the same moment, both of us. The way you stop when a sound reaches both your ears simultaneously. We were standing a few feet apart, and I know from my own experience of that moment that I had not decided to stop, had not processed a reason to stop. The stopping happened before any of that. Something responded before I did. I stood and looked at the cabin, and I tried to identify what I was responding to. This is the habit of 12 years of backcountry decision-making. When something makes you stop, you interrogate it. You look for the specific input that triggered the response, because sometimes it's real and important, and sometimes it's a trick of light or pattern recognition misfiring, and you need to know which. I looked at the cabin, and the clearing, and the tree line on the far side, and I ran through everything available to my senses. Nothing moved. That was the first thing. The clearing was completely still, not the ordinary stillness of a calm day, but an absence of movement that extended to things that are usually moving even in still conditions. No leaves shifting, no grass bending, no birds. The trees at the clearing's edge were as motionless as if they'd been photographed, which is not how trees are, which is not how any of it is. There is always some movement, always something adjusting to the air. There was nothing, no sound. I've been in quiet backcountry. I know what the absence of traffic and machinery sounds like. The way it reveals the layers of natural sound underneath insects, water, wind in the canopy, the movement of animals in the leaf litter. All of that was gone. The clearing had no sound in it. Not the sound of the wind that had been in the trees on the ridge. Not the creak I could hear on the descent. Not anything. The silence had a quality I've tried to describe and never gotten right. Not empty silence. Not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something that occupied the same register as sound and displaced it. I became aware after a moment that Dex had not moved. I glanced at him without turning my head. He was looking at the cabin with the particular focus of someone processing something that resists processing. His jaw was set. His hands were loose at his sides. He was doing what I was doing, which was running the inventory and not finding what should have been there. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved toward the cabin. The moment stretched in a way that moments don't usually stretch. And then, without any signal between us, we both took a step back, and then another. We moved back into the tree line the way you move when you're in a situation where you've decided the correct response is to reduce your profile without announcing the decision deliberately, without turning away, keeping our eyes on the clearing, and the cabin, and the stillness that covered both. When we were back in the timber and the clearing was behind us, and the trees were between us and it, the sound came back. Gradually, the way sound returns after something has suppressed it, the creak audible again. A bird somewhere upslope, the wind in the canopy above us moving the branches in the ordinary way of wind. The return of it was almost physical, like pressure equalizing. We climbed back to the ridge without discussing it. We made camp and made dinner, and the conversation was normal gear, tomorrow's route, the usual texture of an evening at camp. Neither of us brought it up. Not that night, not the following day, not on the drive home. It was 3 months before Dex said anything, and what he said was not a question or a description, but a statement. He said, "I've been thinking about that clearing." I said I had too. He nodded. That was the entire conversation. We have not revisited it. I've tried, in the time since, to identify what the silence was, what it was made of, what was producing it, what kind of natural or human phenomenon could create that quality of suppressed sound in an open clearing in the middle of the day. I've come up with candidates and dismissed them. I've read about infrasound, about the acoustic effects of certain terrain features, about the documented phenomenon of animals going quiet in the presence of predators, and what that does to the ambient sound of a landscape. None of it accounts for what we experienced. None of it accounts for the quality of that silence, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that sound could not coexist with. I've also thought about the cabin itself, the intact roof, the solid walls, the closed door. In 12 years of hiking the Blue Ridge, I've seen a lot of abandoned structures, and I know what they look like. They look abandoned. They look like the people who left them are gone and not coming back. That cabin did not look like that. That cabin looked like somewhere that was still being used for a purpose I didn't understand by something that had no interest in being approached. I don't know what was in that clearing. I don't know what we responded to, or why we responded to it simultaneously without any communication between us. I know that in 12 years of shared backcountry experience, Dex and I have never left a trail early, have never retreated from terrain without a specific identifiable reason, have never made a decision that one of us couldn't explain to the other afterward. The clearing below the ridge is the only exception. We left, and we didn't discuss it, and we've never gone back. And what I find most difficult to sit with is not the memory of the silence, or the stillness, or the wrongness of it. It's that Dex and I, separately, arrived at the same conclusion in the same moment, which means whatever was in that clearing communicated something to both of us simultaneously, clearly enough that we both understood it without ambiguity. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it communicated. The conclusion I keep arriving at is that it wasn't a warning. Warnings tell you to go away. What we felt in that clearing was something more specific than that. It told us we were already known.